You will? I thought this is our
And
own.
we are live in 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon. I'm Joe Chuman, and I'd like to welcome you to our ongoing series of interviews with noted writers. By way of personal introduction, I should say I'm a leader of the Society for Ethical Culture in New York City. I'm also a professor of human rights, teaching in the graduate program at Columbia University, and I teach from time to time at Hunter College as well. This afternoon we have a very special guest. I should say he is a very good friend of mine. I've known for, I should say now, almost half a century, if not more. Maybe more, yes. Thank you. Let me introduce him. He is Dr. Arthur Dobrin, and his career, his professional life spreads very broadly. For many years, as with myself, Dr. Dobrin was a leader of the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island. In Garden City. After he retired from that position, Arthur went on to become a professor of humanities at Hofstra College, teaching a whole range of courses, many of them invested in the application of ethics to various aspects of life, as well as literature, and so on and so forth. But today, for our interview, we're most focused on Arthur's career as a writer. And I'm happy to say that he is extraordinarily prolific. Arthur has authored more than 25 books in a variety of genres. He's written poetry, nonfiction. He's contributed to academic texts. He's written plays. Arthur has also written several children's books and a range of novels. I should say, in terms of novels, this book that we're going to interview him on this afternoon comes out of his experience beginning in the 1960s as a volunteer in the Peace Corps. Arthur and his wife Lynn spent several years in Kenya working for the Peace Corps in the 1960s. They fell in love with the country and in fact have gone back to visit Kenya more than a dozen times. Arthur has good friends in Kenya. He knows the country intimately. He and his wife were committed to building a school in Kenya. He follows the political scene in that country, and it's really been a lifelong pursuit. Now, that segues into the book that we're going to be discussing with Arthur this afternoon. It's a novel. It's called This Red Land. It's part of a series of books that take part in whole or in part in Kenya, and we'll be talking about that aspect of the book and others in a few minutes. So, greetings, Arthur. Great to see you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm glad you were able to make it, survive the trip all the way from Long Island. So
it's easier to get to Kenya than it is to get to New Jersey from Long Island.
Right, and I'm sure some days it is. We all know about the Cross Bronx Expressway and the adventures that has for us. Okay, we're talking about this novel, The Red Land. Okay, first question, simple one. What was your inspiration for writing this book?
Well, this book is really the last of a series which I think of as the Kwamboka Quartet. And there are 4 books, beginning with the book that's called Salted with Fire. And Salted with Fire was inspired by a comment, probably in the early 1980s, with a conversation with a friend of mine, when I realized that Lynn and I were in Kenya at an extraordinary time. The country was independent for a year and a half when we had gotten there. It had been colonized in the late 19th century, and in December 1963, it received its independence. We arrived in June of 1965. And we were there for 2 years. Then we went back again 10 years later to live with our kids for 5 months, and we've kept up our relationship ever since. And from that conversation, it was the recognition that we had been there knowing, literally, this is not an exaggeration, we literally knew the person who saw the first white person to come into this area. He became the senior chief. He lived through this year from 1905 when the British arrived where we had lived in Kisii, an area called Kisii. And then there were people who were born after independence. So this was an extraordinary arc in a country that we had experienced and had seen it through this era. So the idea came into my mind that I could write a series of short stories about the first and the last things in that country. That is the first incursion of Europeans, and then the end of colonialism, and the beginning of people who never experienced colonialism. So I began to fool around with some of the short stories. That morphed into a novel. And what happened was that there was a character that came into my mind loosely based upon some people that I knew, Sarah Kwamboka, and she was the main character of what turned out to be a novel. She came into my life, so to speak, which is, I didn't have a plan for what her story was. There was an incident that happened in East Africa about the time I began to write, and they said, "Oh, that was interesting. It was a train accident." And I said, and many people were killed. And I said, "Well, she was on that train, and didn't die. And then what happened to her? How did she survive? What were the relationships? Who were the people involved in her life? And then what happened to her, during her recovery?" That was really the genesis of this. That was 4 novels ago.
Right.
And what happened was that Kwamboka never left me. After the first novel, it sat dormant for a number of years. It was like Kwamboka came knocking at my door and said, "Hey, wait, my story is not finished yet." And I wrote the second novel about Kwamboka. That wasn't finished either. There was the third novel that involved Kwamboka. And then This Red Land was the fourth and final novel that involved Kwamboka. So when you ask about the genesis of this particular novel, it really stretches back to about 1980, although this one was published only, I think, 4 years ago or so.
Right. But let me just sort of segue into a question that arises, which I think is interesting, that is more generic. You mentioned this character who's been with you for a long time.
For a very long
created her
time.
4 books ago, and she's still here. I think this may be the last, unless she's resurrected, because she, sort of spoiler alert, she is killed in this book, and I suspect killed off, and she's not coming back. But I'm curious about the creative process. And this could pertain to any book that you write, any novel that you write. What is your relationship, if I can ask that question, open-ended question, what's your relationship with the characters whom you create? I mean, you describe her almost as someone whom you live with or is deeply internalized, who has become part of your psyche, part of your personality, and so on. Talk to me about your relationship to the major fictional characters whom you create.
Well, when I started writing about Sarah Kwamboka, I call her Kwamboka. She didn't use her European name, as many Kenyans
Right.
don't. So Kwamboka, when I was writing about her, she was so real that I was leaving messages around the house as if they were from Kwamboka that even got my wife a little bit jealous. Like, who is this woman who is living, or you're living with, or she's living with you? It is that real.
Right.
As I said, it's based loosely upon some women that we knew. But beyond that, to describe the relationship I had with her and why it is I say I don't really know what was going to happen to her until she came and the next day when I was writing and told me what happened to her, was much like, at the same time I was actually doing counseling. Therapy. I had gone to the Ackerman Institute and gotten a certificate in family therapy.
Right.
So I was seeing couples. I was really doing couples work, and it was much like somebody would tell me about their life. Somebody would call and say, "I'd like to make an appointment to see you." And on the telephone, I'd say, "Well, tell me a little bit about why. What's going on?" And they tell me very little. First time I would see them, they would reveal a little bit more. So the second time I would see them, I could not anticipate what they were going to say, but rarely was it a total surprise what they were going to say. I began to know them.
Right.
And this is much like the creative process in writing a novel with characters, which is I know a little bit about them before I sit down to write what they're going to tell me. But I really can't fully anticipate who they are or what they're going to tell me. And sometimes I'm completely surprised. What they tell me goes off in a direction that I did not anticipate.
Right. We can get lost in this discussion because it's so interesting. But one more question here. I mean, it may sound a little woo-woo, but do the characters sort of have a life of their own? I mean, do they sort of speak to you in ways that in some ways are surprising, or the way in which a person in real life may approach you and begin to present herself or himself in ways that, you know, you simply don't expect? I mean, does that happen with the fictional
Oh,
character?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It certainly happened more often in the earlier novels. I said this is the fourth one. By the time I've been living with Sarah, or Sarah's been living, Kwamboka's been living with me for 30 years, I really knew her pretty well.
Right.
There wouldn't be much that she could say that would be a complete surprise to me.
Right.
I've known her very, very intimately
Right. So
through,
she's really-
through several
Yeah,
relationships
she's
that
a
had.
consistent character.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Okay. Before we get actually into the story itself, I want to ask you another sort of background question. The United States and Kenya. I mean, the story takes place in other places, including Japan, but it's primarily the venues are Kenya and the U.S., right? Given the fact that you spent a lot of time in Kenya and it's a place that's important to you, what is the relationship, if you can just sort of associate to this, what is the relationship between Kenya and the United States? Now, we have with Barack Obama a contemporary nexus, a contemporary linkage between the two countries. When we think of the United States and its foreign relations, we think at the current moment, of course, with Europe, right, in terms of unification of NATO and with regard to the war in Ukraine and so forth. We don't think too much about the United States having specific, significant relationships with African countries where there's an interpenetration of economies and, more interestingly, in terms of cultures. Can you say a little bit about the history of Kenya vis-a-vis the United States?
Well, Kenya had been a British colony.
Right.
And obviously, during the Cold War, Britain and the United States were allies.
Right.
So in that way, at least up until independence,
Right.
Kenya was a secure position in the Cold War in terms of the West.
Right.
But there was a lot of contended or contentious grounds there in Africa, as
Right.
we knew in the Congo. I mean, the Congo was a big deal with
Right.
Patrice Lumumba's assassination and the CIA's involvement in it.
Sure.
In 1960, the United States initiated what was called the Kennedy Initiative, or the Kennedy Airlift, and that's where Barack Obama's father came. This was in 1960. There were about 300 Kenyans that came, and the idea was that if they came to the United States, they got their university degrees here, they would be committed to the West in the Cold War. And when Kenya became independent, Russia and China and the U.S. really were battling ideologically in Kenya. Kenya is probably the most developed country in East Africa.
Right.
Not necessarily now; it's probably the most prosperous in the sense that it has a significant middle class. But at that point, there were still the British influence there was really very, very heavy. But it was a settler colony,
Right.
which made it different than any place else in Kenya, with the exception of maybe two other countries. So there was a large white presence there, and while many settlers left, many expatriates came in terms of NGO projects, non-governmental projects, aid projects, and it was an attempt to keep Kenya in the orbit of the West during the Cold War. While we were there, there was a big split in the country, with the president, Kenyatta, clearly in the Western camp, although he had been educated in Moscow and had originally, during the Mau Mau period, was detained for 10 years as a alleged communist.
Right.
But when he became president, he was clearly in the Western camp. And the person who opposed him was perceived as being in the Russian camp. And the president had him arrested, and he was detained. So there was a lot of this, and we saw this. I mean,
Right.
I saw a convoy go through the town we lived in, and stopped, and people were arrested, and allegedly there were communist arms,
Right.
automatic
So the
weapons
Cold
on the
War
convoy.
was really playing out.
Oh,
to some-
absolutely,
yes, in
play out
Kenya,
there,
right.
and it still is in a way, but it's not the Cold War any longer. It has to do with terrorism, because of Somalia and Ethiopia and northern Kenya, where their terrorism has been rampant, and southern Sudan.
Right.
Kenya has really been looked at as being a model of stability. And
Well, we'll talk about that later as
Yeah,
we get into
okay.
the story itself. I mean,
Okay.
there's some questions about that. Okay, let's get into the characters, and then I have a related question that sort of segues a bit from what you've just been saying, Arthur. There are three main characters. There's Junius, who is an African American who is born and raised in Brooklyn. There's Lena, who is very much a New York Jew, right? And then there's Sarah Kwamboka, as you mentioned, who is Kenyan. Now, what's interesting in your story that caught my attention is that these people have their own individual parochial identities, but they all transcend their identities in some ways and become, in their own way, maybe I'm overstating it, become in some sense cosmopolitan figures. Junius, in effect, travels and does business in Japan. I thought that was interesting, if not odd, for an African American to be sufficiently comfortable to make his way in Japan. He, in effect, for a while, is engaged or involved with Lena in a romantic live-in relationship, so he transcends his racial identity in terms of an interracial relationship and beyond his religious background, of course. And then there's Sarah, who comes from Kenya, and she comes to New York City, becomes friendly with Lena as well. Lena is sort of the keystone of the three that they, in effect, where they come together. But Sarah gets her doctorate at NYU and then goes back to Kenya. So all of these characters, interestingly enough, transcend their parochial identities and backgrounds and have, I would use the word, maybe it's overstated, a type of cosmopolitan sensibility that enables them to relate to others outside their group and also to travel internationally and to live on other continents, whether it's an African coming to America or Americans going to Africa and so forth. I was wondering if you can talk about that sensibility, whether that's true to life, whether you were ahead of your time, and what your feelings about the whole cosmopolitan ethos that you are endowing these characters with.
Well, I don't think that I don't think I endow any of my characters. I think the characters come to me. Now, of course, right. Having said that, if somebody else was writing the stories, the characters would take on
so
different
what was on the character's
characteristics.
mind to basically?
But it is to say that
Right.
I can't answer your question in any direct way because it's not conscious. These are characters who develop, and as I said, they are based on people that I know to some extent. And they are the way I think these characters would have wound up having lived their lives.
Right.
Now, Junius, I would say, in some ways, is the person I would have known least. He was, as you said, he's African American, but he did grow up. I make all of these characters the same age. They're contemporaries of mine.
Yes.
That is, we're all growing up in the same era.
That's true. Yeah.
Right. So I know New York.
Right.
And while it is true that black friends were few and far between when I was young, I could imagine what Junius's life had been like.
Although you do come from Brooklyn.
I do come from Brooklyn, and I grew up actually very close to where I placed Junius. He grows up and I put him in an area that's Weeksville, and even when he grows up, he has no idea what Weeksville is. That area of Brooklyn really is only uncovered. It's historically uncovered, not until I think the late 70s, early 80s, and maybe even a little bit later than that. But I place him with his mother having grown up there, and she's part of this African-American community in Brooklyn that had been an independent and self-sufficient community in Brooklyn from the 1840s.
What does that mean?
What it means is that it was that area of Brooklyn was east of the city of Brooklyn. It's now what we call Ocean Hill, Bedford-Stuyvesant area. But it was the people who owned property there were African Americans. They were independent. They had their own businesses. Some of them were professionals. I believe it was the first African American woman nurse was from that area. People had their own businesses, or they may have worked in the city. They owned property. It was independent. It was self-sufficient. It was unique. I mean, there were a few other places in New York that were like this.
Talking about for Weeksville?
Well, this was Weeksville was started about 1840,
Right.
and it really deteriorated probably starting in about 1920s for a variety
So
of
your
reasons.
character really emerges
He
well
emerges.
after that.
He emerges when Weeksville. People didn't even know. Nobody
Yes.
really called it Weeksville. It was now Bedford Stuyvesant, and it was becoming poorer and poorer. But his family, I situate them as a family that had been middle class for many years, 80 years or whatever it was at that
Interesting,
point. So it was like 3 generations of middle class African Americans, but being swamped by the area becoming poorer and poorer, and Bedford Stuyvesant, as we know, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s,
Right.
was one of the poorest and worst neighborhoods in the city.
Yeah, we should actually go back and situate your novel in time because,
Yeah.
as I recall, nowhere, I could have missed it, but nowhere in the book do you actually state a particular date
Correct.
when this takes place. You
Right.
have to infer it from, this is a historical novel, you have to infer what the timeline is from events that are going on around the characters, right? So when you introduce Junius, who's the first major character on the scene, does his story begin in the 1960s?
Begins in the 1950s.
50s,
He's already like 10 years old or something like that.
Right.
And I don't like hitting people over the head with the dates. I mean, when you meet somebody and you talk to them and you're getting to know them, they don't say, "Oh, I was born in 1950," or "I went to school in I went to Queens College in 1970." Joe, you would say to me, "I went to Queens College," and later you find out. So I like writing stories where you find out about the characters. It's revealed. But even in the first chapter with Junius, the clue is that he goes out to Long Island with his family, because they say, this is really getting bad, and there's more opportunities out there for Long Island. Maybe I could work in the aircraft industry out there, his father says. And they go to Levittown.
Right.
And Levittown is just being built.
Right.
And they are put we're Nobody says to them, we're not going to sell to a black family. But we know that there was a covenant, and that they would not allow that to happen. Now, what I do for some readers who bother to get to the end of the book and flip through it, in the back there is an appendage, and the appendage are footnotes to all the things that happen in that in each of the chapters, which lets you know what the context is. And some people are interested in that. Some people don't care about it. Some people want to know immediately what year are we talking about, and other people enjoy figuring it out.
Right. Well, that was one very interesting thing I thought about the book. I mean, it's a historical novel, and let me see if I can articulate this. You, in effect, have various episodes. I mean, there is, frankly, it's not all that easy to find a unified linear narrative in this book. There are many of episodes that take place that are historically take place within episodes that are in effect historically accurate, and these fictional characters are sort of embedded in those particular episodes. The Covenant, for example, in Levittown is one of them, right? And you make that explicit as a historical fact in your appendix where you lay out the history. There are many such episodes which I thought were very interesting, and someone who is historically knowledgeable will be able to know that. Others might not, but it's integral to the way in which you've crafted the book. Okay, let's talk about Junius. He grows up in Brooklyn, in Weeksville, as you say. One interesting thing that you mentioned in passing, but it seems symbolically perhaps important, is that he doesn't know where his name comes from. But he speculates it might come from a George Junius who was executed, right? This was a government execution, the death penalty, executed when he was only 14 years old. He's a young black kid who's executed. And you just mentioned that in passing. That's a historical event, right? So how does that figure into, if it does, into Junius's identity, or why is that significant if it is significant? You included it.
Yeah. Well, Junius it's an unusual name.
Right.
One of the possibilities I didn't mention here is, and I still don't quite understand why this is so, but very close to where he grew up, there is actually a Junius Street. Now, I don't know why. So, and the name Junius sort of came to me. There was no pre-planning on why this was. But when Junius has this name, and Sarah meets him, and it's like, that's an unusual name. So I would imagine a kid who grows up with an unusual name would have some curiosity, not initially. And, what do they know? But when you get a little bit older, you begin to wonder about your name, if it's an odd one. So he does ask his, he goes back and asks, and, one is that his grandfather is Junius. Well, but where did his grandfather get this weird name from? Well, when he begins to do a little bit of investigating when he's much older, one of the possibilities is that one of the very first people who settled Weeksville was named Junius. His first name was Junius. So, maybe that's where it comes from. Even a little bit later on, the story about Junius, who was known as George Junius Stinney in South Carolina, that story was really unknown, virtually unknown anywhere. It was forgotten, covered up. Deliberately and otherwise. Only later did people begin to, uncover the story, right. And then that's when he wonders about it. And if Junius's family came from the South, and I have his father comes from the South, his mother not, his mother's from New York. Maybe his father did know about this. Maybe that's another reason why. And the story of Junius Stinney, who was executed, is the youngest person ever executed in the United States. He was so small when he was executed, they had to sit him on a bunch of books because they couldn't get this thing that they lowered on his head to execute him. It didn't fit.
It's a stark.
It's an incredible story. Yeah. And Stinney was. I guess what is the word? Exonerated or pardoned, whatever it was, just maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Really? Okay.
So the story it continues to have some currency.
Okay. I think it would pay to put a little meat on the bones. Just if you can basically describe Junius's biography, his trajectory through the book.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
We should get a sense of some narrative element.
Yeah.
In here.
Well, yeah. Junius, is born sometime in the early 1940s, right. And he's very much interested in music. He loves to sing, and he puts together a group of singers, just as kids might do, that they love singing underneath the trestle of the Atlantic Avenue, where the Long Island Railroad is above ground over there in Brooklyn. So they sing there, and he calls the group the Sparrows. And initially, there's a white kid, an Italian kid, as part of this group, and then right. The others are all black, and then the black kid moves away. It's like the neighborhood gets. This is white flight from Brooklyn at right. this period. So now they're all black, and they sort of joke, well, maybe we should have called ourselves the Blackbirds instead of the Sparrows, which are multicolored. So he likes singing, and while he's singing, he's in high school, and likes singing so much that his mother doesn't want him to go to the local school, which would have been boys' high school, too rough at the time, and his mother convinces him to go to another school. So he goes to music and art. And at Music and Art, he continues to sing. And while he's singing, during one summer, after school, there's a riot in Brooklyn. And he doesn't know from the riot. I mean, it begins in Manhattan and then spreads throughout the city. It's one of the very first citywide, what they call race riots at the time. And he's singing out there one night, and Bedford-Stuyvesant goes up in flames. But again, he doesn't pay any attention. He's so interested in the singing. And a cop runs by, chasing somebody from the riot, and sees him and arrests him.
Right.
He's not doing anything. He gets arrested and winds up in jail, and his father has to bail him out. And his father, because his father is very active in the union and therefore has some political connection with some of the local black politicians, he's able to work out a deal where Junior is now, instead of going to trial, can go to the army instead.
Right.
And he winds up going to the army. And in the army, he's fortunate enough that, again, through some connections, he winds up with the army band stationed in New York.
Right.
But he's a singer, and the army band doesn't really have singers, not at least in the unit I placed him in. So he has to learn how to play some instrument there, which is sort of ridiculous, and they don't know what to do with him. And there's one person he meets there who gives him a really hard time. The guy's from the South, and he's a racist. And Junius, has this outburst and is ready to kill the guy, and other people, pull him off. Well, in any case, Junius then winds up. He learns about how to be an engineer, and then from being an engineer in the studio, it expands to being a producer, an agent, and it becomes.
I had a sense of an entrepreneurial sense.
An entrepreneur,
Yes.
right? Actually, that's right. He's managing groups, and he takes one group up to Vermont, and up there he then meets Lena.
Right. Who's on a
one night stand.
Right.
Lena had left New York. She had been drugged out and becomes a hippie and goes to this commune up in Vermont, has enough of the commune.
We're in the 60s now.
This is in the 1960s, right? So this is over a period of 10 years. You asked about his trajectory. So let me stop there. That's how we.
Okay, well, that's good. Although I do want to get into his Japanese phase, which again, I find culturally fascinating.
Right.
Right, in that regard. Okay. Okay, let me just ask you a specific question again about Junius, and that is his black identity.
Yep.
I mean, Malcolm X does make a cameo appearance at one point, I recall.
Who does?
Malcolm X is cited in your book at one point, right? So I'm curious, what is the extent, and yet again, he's comfortable in other worlds, right? And so forth. And there clearly, he's very black identified in one sense, but again, moves outside of his black identity. Can you talk about his black identity and how that figures into his overall identity?
Well, it comes out of him having grown up middle class, which was certainly his mother was very comfortable with who she was, in the way that, let's say, somebody who is successful and comfortable in who they are in any other ethnic group, it's not their dominant identity. So he doesn't grow up saying what's most important to me is that I am African American. Now, things happen to him because he's African American that wouldn't happen to other people.
Right.
But nevertheless, it's not his major identity. And when his mother doesn't let him go to the local high school, which would have been probably 99% African American, but instead he goes to Music and Art High School. Music and Art, it's Music and Art. Music and Art High School was very mixed, and it was probably predominantly white. But his being there, his identity is music. His identity is not his blackness.
Right.
So his identity as being wrapped up in music is more important, is more salient than his black identity.
Yeah, like all the characters, he's complex.
He's complex.
He's very complex. Let's move on to Lena and her story, and they do come together at some point.
Yes, they do.
You do mention. Okay, Lena, just as Junius was the character you felt most difficult to identify with, I should say Lena is the one that I was most identified with. Lena is Jewish. She's intellectual. She's introspective. She is, in effect, I guess, a red diaper baby. Her father was a dogmatic leftist, right? But her political thinking does evolve. She basically, I guess, has to cope with her father's sort of dogmatic leftism and, in some ways.
That's to put it mildly.
Yes, to put it mildly. Well, we know people like that. And she has to, cope with that and becomes, in some ways, I was thinking of John Lennon in this regard, becomes more mellowed out and more her political, I wouldn't say she's a New Ager, it's not quite the New Age, but it becomes more personal rather than hardcore on the barricades political. She's a child of the 60s, and in some ways I felt she was most representative of identifiable type, okay? Can you talk about her and her political evolution a little bit more? And was she modeled on people you knew personally?
Well, I knew one woman that is a similar, very close background to that. So in that sense, yes, she's modeled on somebody I know. But that person, that model, only went as far as high school. After that, Lena takes on a life that's completely different, and one that I'm not totally familiar with from a woman's point of view. But in the 1960s, there becomes the split when the war becomes so dominant in the lives of people who were growing up in that period, high school, college, that I think that many people made a choice. And the choice was, I will continue to be political and try to stop this horrendous war politically.
We're talking about Vietnam.
Right. And there were others who said, that's hopeless. It's not going to change that way. I have to be the change that I want the world to be, right? So for some people, what that meant was, I'm not going to be political. That's ridiculous. We're beating our heads up against a stone wall here. What we need to do is to start all over again. And the commune would be the extreme example of that, which is, okay, we're going to go and we will start to create a world that would be the world as we think it ought to be. It's non-political. It's completely personal. It's anarchic in some sense. There, whatever rules are going to be are going to come out of us. Nobody's going to impose them upon us. That's where she chooses to go.
It's also a type of new left sensibility of a certain type.
Yes, it was. Right. Yeah. But it also was very much involved in drugs. And so she goes up to this commune. She had been really, as I said, she became a sort of a druggie in the city. She just kicks around from one apartment to another, and she's lost. She becomes what the old term would be a libertine. That is, there are no boundaries, sexual or any other sort, and she can't live that way any longer. So she finds this commune. It's sponsored by a church, and although the church has hands off, they just make it happen. She goes up there, and then she can't live there either. It turns out that that's really it's just as oppressive as any other kind of life. Right. So she needs to find her own way. That's where she meets Junius up in Vermont at a cafe. He's up there with his band.
One thing that I did like about her is she hangs out at the Strand bookstore a lot.
She
on
does.
12th Street and Broadway.
She does.
That's right.
She
reads a lot.
Yes, but I don't think of her as an intellectual. She's somebody who's very much involved in aesthetics, not in the world of ideas. She lives in the world of poetry. She lives in the world of beauty.
Right.
Junius lives in the world of music.
Okay.
Of the three characters, it's Kwamboka who most lives in the world of politics.
Yes, she does. We'll get to her in a few minutes, but let's talk about, since we began that journey, let's talk about the intersection of Junius and Lena. They meet in Vermont, and what happens to them?
They meet in Vermont in essentially a one-night stand. Junius is from New York, and he's just up there singing with his band, but essentially he's managing them. They have a one-night stand, and he's leaving. He says, "Look, if you want to if you're coming to New York, give me a call." Neither of them expect much is going to happen, except Lena decides to take him up on it. She misses New York. She misses what she had in New York, even though it was crazy. So she actually comes back to New York, gives him a call, and they meet. They have dinner. He invites her back to his apartment. Where else was she going to go? And it turns out that they had a lot of attraction to one another. That goes far beyond just a one-night stand. They love each other. They really fall in love with one another. And he continues to become more and more involved in the music world. She decides to get back into her intellectual life. He convinces her to go back and get her degree, and he underwrites it. And they have a very nice life together until they go to a disco. And at the disco, she feels left out. He's gone, and he's making his business deals, behind closed doors. And here she is, surrounded by all these drugs again, surrounded by all of these people who are looking for just a hookup or wherever that might be. And who knows why? Maybe out of revenge, she decides to go off with a woman, which was not the first time in her life that she does this. And it also turns out that she's pregnant. And Junius is happy about this. He would like to have a child with her, probably would like to get married. And this is not what she had thought her life
Right.
was going to be. So she goes off and she has an abortion without telling him. And that's the end of their relationship.
Right. Okay. Very good. Now, let's get back to Junius before we get to Sarah. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, a lot of episodes here. Let's talk about the side trips to Japan, which
Yeah.
I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
Again, this comes out of his entrepreneurial and business commitments in search of markets and business opportunities. Talk a little bit. I thought that was sort of odd for an African American to find himself in Japan and reasonably comfortable there.
Yeah. It was odd, but not unheard of. By the time that Junius goes off to Japan to, again, on business about in music, the music field, there were already several albums that were made by jazz musicians and singers in Japan that were in person. They were concerts. They weren't studio
Right.
recordings. Sarah Vaughan, Miles Davis,
Right.
I believe John Coltrane, and a few Shirley Bassey. They all by this point had albums that were in concert in Japan, and they were not many of them. Several of these were not even released in the United States, but they were popular in
Yeah,
Japan.
See, this is an interesting historical side
Yeah.
point you put in that was not known or not generally known.
And there were several jazz musicians who decided to go to Japan, just as there were several who went to Europe because they couldn't stand the racism here.
Okay.
There wasn't racism in Japan. It was a very odd culture for them to be in, and they were odd and they were strange there, and they were treated as strangers, but it wasn't racism.
Interesting. Okay, we have to talk about Sarah and move the venue out of the United States.
She's my favorite.
Well, I was gonna
She's my
say that. I
love.
could tell.
She's my love. We
Yeah,
can't
I
leave
could
out.
tell-
We
I could
can't
tell
leave out
I
Kwamboka.
could tell that she was your favorite, even though you don't say so. I could tell she's certainly the character, as you pointed out in the introduction, of longest standing. So you know her the best in a way. We want to talk about her, and of course that moves the story to your beloved Kenya. And we have talked. Tell us about Sarah. Okay. Let's talk about Sarah and her story, but let's get back to what you had said earlier about the transition from colonialism to independence, because her story really takes place, in some sense, against the background.
She's the bridge.
She's the bridge, right? The background of that transition. So let's talk about that however you will. Right.
Yeah. Well, she grows up in the part of Kenya that we know that was least touched by colonialism than most parts of the country. There were no settlers there.
Right.
So this was an area that was sort of left on its own,
This
more
is,
or
this
less.
is Kisii, the Kisii
This is
area.
Kisii.
Sort of in the Nairobi is sort of in the east central part of the country. Kisii is further northwest, is it not?
Kisii is almost directly west of Nairobi.
It's west of Nairobi.
It's well, you could it almost borders Lake Victoria.
Okay.
But south of the equator, just as Nairobi is south of the
right,
equator.
yeah.
But not far. I mean, the equator is only 80 miles north of where we lived. So this is where she is born. It's where she goes to school. She is schooled, and she's really a smart kid, and winds up getting these scholarships, and winds up in going to University of Nairobi. This is all pre-independence. While she's there, Kenya gets its independence, and she winds up getting a scholarship to get her degree in University of London, and that's where she gets her doctorate. But then where is she going to teach? She thinks of coming back to Kenya, and she calls somebody that she knows there, the person who actually rescued her from this terrible train accident,
Right.
and gives her blood donation, blood transfusion, which donation of her blood, which saves her life. He happens to be white, so she already has this connection to the white world, and while she's there, she gives him a call and says, "Look, I got my degree. I really want to come back to Kenya and teach." And on the telephone, he says, "Don't do this. This is not good. The political situation here is so much in turmoil that this is not really the best place for you to go. Why don't you see about going someplace else?" So she does, and she winds up coming to New York,
To NYU.
NYU.
Now, what is the nature of the turmoil that deters her from going to Kenya? Why is it simply not professionally promising, or was there a situation of danger?
There was a situation of danger. Universities were constantly being closed down because there were students who were rioting for one reason or another.
I see.
And it was just a mess.
Right.
It really was a mess.
Right.
So that's what she does. She winds up coming to.
Yeah, can you tell us a
New York.
little bit about her personally? I mean, her personal attributes and temperament.
Well,
and so forth?
she is modeled on some Kenyan women that we knew,
Okay.
that we know. Really very strong, independent, and very. I'll give you an example of one of the people that she's modeled on. The person it was the president of the Kenya Social Workers Association, and she was very, very outspoken, very political. I wouldn't say she was prominent, but there were Kenyan women who were prominent. Wangari Maathai, for example, who winds up getting the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
She is the contemporary of Sarah Kwamboka. So they could have known each other, and I wind up putting her in a situation where, in fact, she does know her,
Right.
meets her.
Yeah, it is sort of interesting. I mean, there is not any reference to a self-conscious feminist ideology, and yet she is very assertive. So forth. There's a guy whom she has to stand up to, a man who's her supervisor, and basically rebels again, has no respect for him and rebels against him, and so on. Is this commonplace in Kenya, or is she an outlier in that regard?
Well, she is not unusual.
Okay.
I wouldn't say she's typical, but it's not unusual that women would do this. It turns out that where we had lived in a program that Lynn, my wife, had actually established while we were there in 1965, 66, 67, a program called Maendeleo ya Wanawake, which means women's progress in Swahili. Lynn established the first such program in Kenya, in Kisii. And unbeknownst to us, many, many years later when we went back, it turned out that in the national program, the person who was the president was somebody from Kisii, who could have been one of the women who was meeting in our house there. Our house was the club site. We don't know that. But these were women who were able to socialize with one another from across the district for the first time, out of the side of their husbands. And they had a lot to say. And women were really very independent. Women were the farmers, not the men. The men did the labor. The men might build the fences. The men would control the money if it was from a cash crop, not from a not from a subsistence crop. But the women already there was a sense of independence of women, and it becomes very strong with some of the women that we knew.
Right. Well, she comes to NYU, right?
Yeah.
And she teaches at NYU. She's a professor at NYU.
Yep.
She meets Lena. Yeah.
Lena, who was a librarian at
She's
NYU
a librarian.
at
That point, she's a librarian, right?
Yep.
And they develop a type of rapport, right?
Yeah, they meet each other and they wind up living together, and Sarah they love one another, but Sarah, Lena loves Sarah in Kwamboka in a way that Kwamboka could not reciprocate. That is, that Lena really wanted to love her as a lover. Now probably would want to get married to her. Now Kwamboka doesn't go that far. This is something that for her is totally strange, totally unnatural for women to have, or to have a homosexual relationship. So that is their relationship, is that they live together. They are very close, and clearly Kwamboka loves her. The most intimate relationships traditionally that people would have in Kenya was brother to brother, and it would be women to women.
Right.
It was very. I was really very much taken aback when I first got there, and somebody that I knew, a guy downtown, very publicly, takes my hand and walks with me, holding my hand through the street to introduce me to all of his friends. Only later did I learn that men held hands with men, women held hands with women, but men and women did not hold hands publicly.
Well, Yeah, and yet it's ironic, isn't it? I mean, that's a superficial sort of affinity in a sense, because we can say the entire continent of Africa, with perhaps the exception of parts of South Africa, Cape Town maybe, is homophobic.
Yeah,
Right, so
well,
you
that's
find
right.
that,
And it
right.
was homophobic when we were there.
Right.
People would say to us, "I heard in your country that sometimes men are, sleep with men." And I'd say, "Well, yeah, but how about here?" And they'd say, "Oh, no, not here. Can't possibly be here."
Right. Okay. Sarah teaches at NYU and then has a relationship with Lena, then returns, goes back to Kenya,
Yep.
and works in a school for a type of authoritarian, a bit self-impressed male head of school, right, director, and she has a falling out, a confrontation with him, and she very assertively goes her own way and wants to develop her own school, right, and becomes a type of educational notable in Kenya. I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship she has with her supervisor and
Well,
so forth,
the
and where that
supervisor
goes.
is very pompous.
Yes.
And again, modeled upon many men that I
Right.
knew who were pompous. I don't think I ever knew a woman who was pompous, but I certainly knew lots of men who were
Right.
pompous, who were
Right,
just
right.
they puff out their chests. No pun intended here at the Puffin Institute, but
Right.
yeah, they were pompous men. So she had this run-in with him. The main problem that she has in the school, she's very much supported by local people, both men and women, because the school that she was working at wasn't really very good. Now she has the major falling out she has with him, though, is an ideological one. You might call it political, which is that she thought that the children would learn best if they were being taught in their local language,
Right,
that they were being taught in Kisii, the local language.
Right.
Now, in Kenya, wherever people grew up, they knew multiple languages. Everybody was multilingual. You would know your local language, your mother tongue, and you would also most likely know Swahili and also English. Many
Right.
people were trilingual, not unusual at all. People were trilingual. So she thought, though, that for little children, for kids, why not teach them in their local language? They will learn Swahili and English as they go along, but they were most comfortable as children. You would only know the one language. Well, that was ideologically unacceptable in Kenya.
Yeah, well,
for political reasons.
Yeah, no, I read that, and it seemed to me, what decade are we in when this takes place?
This would be the 1980s.
80s, yeah, that's what I thought. But in some ways, it's ahead of its time. I mean, this could be a very contemporary debate and struggle, right?
Yep.
In the sense that we're in a period where there's greater respect for indigenous peoples, their rights, their cultures, cultural hegemony, group rights, and so on and so forth, and the right of people to speak their own language, right? Very contemporary in a type of anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist move that we're experiencing in the human rights world and globally and so forth. So this, in some ways, this struggle seems to be, in some ways, a little early, given its salience at the current moment. But I'm sure it was typical of that time too. And I'm wondering whether his commitment to have the kids learn English was a vestige of colonialism, whether English was construed to be more prestigious and in that sense imperious.
Well, that is an argument that was made, but
Right.
it was not made by all Kenyans.
Right.
Other Kenyans were arguing that Swahili was the imperialist language.
Ah, okay.
And the reason is that in Kenya, there are, I don't know what it is, 40, 60 different languages, depending on how you consider a language, as opposed to just a dialect. But someplace in that range, it's really lots of languages. You go 30 miles and people are speaking a different language. In some parts of the country, the languages that they were speaking, the mother tongues, were related to Swahili in the sense that they're Bantu based. But in other parts of the country, the mother tongue is not Bantu based. That is, the Swahili would be as foreign to them as English would be foreign to them. And the notion of Swahili being pushed as a language was at that point the tribe that was politically in control of the country.
Right.
And those people who did not speak Bantu-based languages said, "We want to learn English." English is the language of the world. It's really the most progressive language as far as we're concerned.
Right.
Don't push Swahili on us. So there was this debate. A debate was also going on in the United States at about the same time, and at that time it was called Ebonics. It was in the black community. Kids ought to be learning. We should be teaching them Ebonics.
Right.
Well, and then people said, well, yeah, if you do that, look what's going to happen. It's going to be a dead end for these kids.
Right.
How in the world are they ever going to get a job in the larger community?
Right.
Which is not, who knows about Ebonics, right? So it was a similar kind of debate that was going on there. Actually, more complex in Kenya because of the English, Swahili,
multiplicity
and mother tongue debates.
Multiplicity of languages.
Right.
Okay, I think unfortunately we're going to have to begin to bring this to an end.
Already?
Yeah, well, it's been about an hour. It's very interesting. We could go on for a long time. A few questions I want to ask as we sort of bring this to a close. Just as Sarah's story takes place against the background of colonialism, the sense I get looking at Kenya as you describe it, and it's not a positive image, is that there's a great deal of violence. In fact, Sarah is murdered. Actually, there's Junius in the American context is injured in looked like a gang assault.
He's mugged. He's mugged and he gets
mugged,
stabbed.
Yeah, right. He's mugged. Yeah, right. So a lot of violence in this book, but a lot of it takes place. You have a feeling there's sort of a type of what you might call organic or indigenous violence in Kenya itself. Some of it around elections. There are groups that today we would call sort of paramilitary militias. They are vigilante groups that are basically trying to restore order. You get a sense of an undercurrent of tribal strife and violence. Again, some of it around elections that took place. And Sarah eventually she's killed. She dies a violent death in Kenya. I was wondering if you could talk about that aspect of Kenyan society. And what you were thinking.
Well, yeah, I think that as an outsider from Kenya, that is an American, you would look at it and say, my God, look at all the violence in Kenya. I could tell you when we were in Kenya, there were Kenyans some said, oh, when you go back, can you put me in your suitcase and bring me home? And others have said, you go to the United States, are you crazy? It's such a violent place. People are being killed all the time. There's such high crime in the United States. I'm not going there. So depending on which end of the telescope you're looking at, there were many Kenyans who see, and I think rightly so, the United States is a very violent place. It's really very violent. There were many, many years in which I did not want to go to New York City. Or if I went to New York City, I would be looking over my shoulder. And many places in New York I would not go to. Or many places I certainly would never go to at night. It's still true in many places in the United States. We have the lowest crime rate in for 30, 40 years. But it's still, there's a lot of crime in the United States.
Okay,
we are a violent country.
Yes, let's talk about Kenya. Okay.
Kenya is not different in this regard. When we first arrived there, the violent crime rate in Kisii, where we lived, was higher than the violent crime rate in the United States. However, it was almost exclusively within families, and it had to do with who was going to inherit the land, because you are not a complete person in many parts in Kenya unless you were also had land that was yours.
Right.
But the land with a very high birth rate and the land that was available became harder and harder to acquire. There was crime rates within families in which one mother would kill the child of a co-wife because she wanted her child to inherit the land.
Right.
Having said that it was the highest crime, it was a high crime rate that was higher than the United States. If you didn't have to worry outside of your family, crime was virtually unknown in that regard. I can remember going to a police station and seeing on the bulletin board what crimes they were investigating. It would be that a sock was stolen off somebody's clothesline.
That may be true. You're talking about your experience when you were there, but in the book, that is not the nature of the crime that you're presenting.
She is murdered, and she is murdered, and that was based upon the murder of a good friend of mine,
right,
who owned a school.
I see.
And the crime, they don't know. They know who committed the crime, but they don't know why.
Right.
And there were multiple reasons that it could have been.
Right.
It could have been jealousy. It could have been that people wanted the property that the school was located on.
Right.
So there were multiple possibilities.
Right.
Yes, I knew. Yes, our friend was murdered the way I described the murder of.
Well, I just want to say I don't want to perseverate on this, but the story basically is bookended with an act of violence. I mean, in the very early chapter, the first chapter, you have a very dramatic episode, which remains hanging until the very end, right? It creates a type of tension where a body falls out of an airplane into some street in England, right? And this is a guy who was trying to escape from wherever he was escaping from by crawling into the wheel well of a plane, right? And he falls out, and we've known this to happen as people, try to flee from one place to another. Not obviously, it's not a very intelligent way to travel, but he falls and so forth, and that's a mystery. Then at the end of the story, in the epilogue, it's revealed that he's Socorro, his name is, right? He's fleeing a type of violence. He's a member of a type of militia group and so forth. He's embroiled in violence, and he's trying to get out of there. And he's the character, right, who crawls into the wheel well of the plane.
He's one of the people who kills Kwamboka,
right?
And he kills her because he's paid $10.
Right.
And he's paid $10 because the people are desperately poor.
Right. That's right.
And he comes to Nairobi, and he wants to leave, and somebody tells him you could do this by getting into the wheel well of an airplane.
Right.
So he dies a violent death, not because somebody has killed him,
right,
but because he's trying to escape poverty.
Okay, good. Two more questions. The title, This Red Land.
Yep.
Which is the Red Land? Do, in effect, you make certain brief references to the word red in the book, right? Where does the title come from? What was your point?
The title comes from The Grapes of Wrath, in which John Steinbeck talks about this red land, which is the Okies leaving their the poverty,
right,
and going to California, in which again was a crime-ridden state when they get there.
Right.
So that's where it comes from explicitly. Otherwise, inferentially, it comes from Lena's politics. She grows up as a red diaper baby.
Right.
It comes from the color of the land in Kenya,
right,
where we're in Kisii, which is the red dust of the land, and it comes from the violence that is there both in the United States and in Kenya.
Yeah, you also mentioned one of the characters, I forget which one, has a type of ruddy skin color, I forget.
Well, Lena has red hair. She has bright red hair.
Right. Okay, one final question, Arthur, just to bring this to a close. This is a complex book. There are vignettes of these major characters and a sprinkling of minor ones who float in and out of the book. I'm curious whether there is, when you're putting this together, any specific message you were trying to portray in the distinctive lives of the personages, of the characters, and their cultures, okay? And is there, in their differences, culturally, sexually, racially, and so forth, is there a type of stream of universal humanity that, in effect, is evinced throughout those differences? Were you trying to make some comment at all about universal human attributes and so forth and characteristics?
Well, I'll pull the question apart.
Yes.
One is I do not ever try to do anything deliberately in writing a novel. So the answer is no, that was not my intent.
Okay.
But I write about characters that I care about. And if I care about somebody, that's their humanity. I'm writing about who they are as a human being. So yes, these people are fully, in my mind, fully developed people, and I try to let people draw pictures of these people, let them speak for themselves in a way. And when people can speak for themselves, I think we recognize that, yes, their experiences are different. Well, I'm not black, I'm not a woman. And Lena could say, well, I'm not a man. And Kwamboka can say, I'm not an American. And, they all could say, I'm not that. But underneath that, they all are able to relate to each other because they're also all human beings.
Mm-hmm. It's a good message. I think it's a good place to end. Arthur Dobrin, thank you so very much for this fascinating conversation. The book, which is readily accessible, you can buy it online, is called This Red Land, a novel by my good friend Arthur Dobrin. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you, Joe.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
That was a lot of